Well, hello and welcome to our first episode of Sketches. This is a new video series that's a continuation of our adult Bible class hour that we enjoyed on Sunday mornings before coronavirus restrictions took effect in March. And in that class, we were familiarizing ourselves with the big picture view of the Bible and trying to work our way through the Old Testament and New Testament as quickly as we reasonably could. Well, in these videos, we're going to continue looking at that big picture, but in smaller sizes. And hopefully these are going to be in 15-minute sections. And we're going to spend time looking at one particular aspect of our view into the big picture of the Bible. And I'm hoping that these small lessons, as they may be, will cultivate a lot of good conversation and stimulate a lot of thought on these really small stories within the Bible's big picture. Kind of getting the ball rolling with yet another discussion during our week on spiritual matters. So in today's lesson, we're going to resume where we left off in our class in the history of the divided kingdom in Chronicles. And if you recall, the divided kingdom was formed because there was a division or a split after the reign of Solomon. There was 10 tribes who rebelled against Solomon's son Rehoboam, and they formed the northern kingdom. And there was 2 tribes that stayed loyal to Rehoboam, and they were Judah and Benjamin, and they formed the southern kingdom, also known as Judah, as the northern kingdom became known as Israel. And it's important to note that there's 2 things rather to note significant about the northern kingdom's history, which is where we left off last time we met. And that is that there was not one single good king. And consequently, even after repeated warnings from God's messengers, the tribes of the northern kingdom were taken into captivity by the king of Assyria about 200 years after the split between the 2 kingdoms. The southern kingdom, on the other hand, while they eventually did go into captivity to Babylon, another 100 years or so later, they did have several good kings. And so our study through the history of the southern kingdom is going to spotlight a couple of those that give us some really important lessons and really characteristics of this period in Israel's time, history, and what we should learn from it and take away from those moments. One of those kings is Joash, and that's where we're going to focus on today. And actually the next several lessons is events from the life and times of Joash, such as his narrow escape as a baby from certain death, his being put into power by his uncle and aunt, conspiracy over the Queen Athaliah, and then finally his own turning against his family that raised him. And just what a tragedy that was, and all that he learned from his family and how he could still do that. And so the next couple lessons are going to be on Joash in particular. So if you have a Bible, please turn with me to 2 Chronicles 21, where we kind of get started in really what is the backstory of King Joash's life. And it all goes back to this king Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, who was Joash's great-grandfather. In 2 Chronicles 21, we read this. Now Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Jehoram his son reigned in his stead. And he had brethren, the sons of Jehoshaphat, Azariah and Jehiel and Zechariah and Azariah and Michael and Shephatiah. All these were the sons of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel. And their father gave them great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things, with fenced cities in Judah. But the kingdom gave he to Jehoram, because he was the firstborn. And so we see here King Jehoshaphat as a good king, as a good father, having much wealth and honor and heritage that he's distributing to his sons. But the kingdom he gives to Jehoram because he is the oldest. But then things get dark after that. We see in the scriptures says, "Now when Jehoram was risen up to the kingdom of his father, he strengthened himself and slew all his brethren with the sword, and divers also of the princes of Israel." But it gets worse. Jehoram was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, like as did the house of Ahab, for he had the daughter of Ahab to wife, and he wrought that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord. So Jehoram is really starting off as a very bad king in contrast to his father. Not only is he killing off his own brothers so that he can have the throne, but he's marrying into the household of Ahab, who is the wicked king on the other side of the fence, the kings of Israel, and going along with all their wickedness and debauchery that they are doing. Now, I find this interesting. The next verse we're going to read is in contrast to all this bad news we just read about with King Jehoram. Look at what verse 7 says with me. It says, "Howbeit the Lord would not destroy the house of David because of the covenant that he had made with David, and as he promised to give a light to him and to his sons forever." And this is so neat. We see here, in contrast to the wickedness of Jehoram, we see the promise of God on display, like a diamond situated against a dark black velvet backdrop. The brightness of God's glory is really the focus of this narrative. And it continues to be the focus of the narrative as the story progresses from bad to worse to awful. So just pay attention to that. This is a key verse helping us understand why we're reading the story. It's so that we can see the faithfulness of God and his promise to David. So Jehoram is a bad king, and as a bad king, he meets a bad end. And there's a couple of highlights. We won't go through all the verses here, but basically, the Jehoram suffers revolution or revolt from the neighboring kings of Edom, and then he is also the instigator of a lot of spiritual and moral wickedness. And the Philistines end up killing his own children. So all of his sons except one perish as a result of these Philistines rising up against him. And then not only as if that's not bad enough, but Elisha prophesies to Jehoram that he's going to die by an incurable disease. And the Bible says very bluntly, later on, I'll show you this verse here. It says, "And after all this, the Lord smote him in his bowels with an incurable disease. And it came to pass that in process of time, after the end of 2 years, his bowels fell out by reason of his sickness. So he died of sore diseases. And his people made no burning for him like the burning of his fathers." So he died a terrible disease without any honor, in complete judgment for his wickedness. And so that's Jehoram, who's setting the stage for the next king, who is Ahaziah. And that's what 2 Kings or Chronicles 22 discusses here. We'll look at that now next. "And the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah his youngest son king in his stead, for the band of men that came up with the Arabians to the camp had slain all the eldest. So Ahaziah the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned. 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned in 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri." Now, what's really interesting about Ahaziah is that nothing in his life or his story is exceptionally awful. Ahaziah's fault is that he does whatever his in-laws tell him to do. He does whatever his mother tells him to do. As it says in these verses, "He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to do wickedly. Wherefore he did evil in the sight of the Lord like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father to his destruction." So this young man, though he's not necessarily evil in his own right like his father was, he is wicked because he is foolishly following the wickedness of others and doing what they suggest. And this causes Ahaziah to get caught up in the judgment of the house of Ahab because he is so closely tied in with the house of Ahab. As it says later on, a couple verses, Jehu, well, let's just read them here. It says, "And it came to pass that when Jehu was executing judgment upon the house of Ahab, and found the princes of Judah and the sons of the brethren of Ahaziah that ministered to Ahaziah, he slew them. And he sought Ahaziah, and they caught him, for he was hid in Samaria, and brought him to Jehu. And when they had slain him, they buried him, because, said they, he is the son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. So the house of Ahaziah had no power to keep still the kingdom." So because he's part of the problem of the house of Ahab and has tangled himself up in that family, Ahaziah becomes part of God's solution to that problem and is judged accordingly. So Jehoshaphat, who is the grandfather at this point, was a good king. Jehoram, his son, was a wicked king. Ahaziah, his son, was a foolishly wicked king. Finally, we find after those three kings, a woman steps in to take the throne. It says in verse 10, "But when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal of the house of Judah." So the mother, the grieving mother, I assume, at this point, her solution to this loss of the throne is to take the throne for herself. And not only does she take the throne for herself, but just so that there's no competition, she goes and destroys all her grandchildren. So Ahaziah's brothers are already dead because of the Philistines earlier. But the grandchildren, that is Ahaziah's own children, they are now being executed by Athaliah, the grandmother seeking power by murdering her grandchildren. And it's into this scene that we discover who Joash is. And this is really neat. Verse number 11, it says, "But Jehoshaphat, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons that were slain, and put him and his nurse in a bedchamber. So Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Jehoram, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, for she was the sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah, so that she slew him not." So that whole backstory about Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah and Athaliah is to bring us to this point where we see who Joash is. He is a baby boy, the rightful heir of the throne, who is also completely vulnerable to the outrageous evil of his grandmother, and yet he is scooped up by his aunt Jehoshaphat, and carried away to live with his aunt and uncle in the temple, because that's where they lived since Jehoiada was the priest, or since Jehoshaphat married the priest Jehoiada. And so that is how we learn who Joash is this evil, dark, black backdrop of the evil wickedness of these men and women rulers over Judah. And into that story, we see God rescuing this baby Joash. Why does he do it? It's certainly not because he's just cute and adorable and lovely. It's because God has made a promise and he's going to fulfill it by any means necessary. And so really the big lesson, or the big view that we want to see here, or the view of the big picture we want to see here, is that God is faithful to fulfill his covenant promises no matter what the circumstances have been set against it. There's a wicked king, there's a foolish king, there's an evil grandmother, and yet those, as dark as they may be, are no match for the power and faithfulness of God in these times. If God's promises were dependent on circumstances to grow or to flourish or to come to fruition, then we'd have no hope. But God's power and God's character are all that is required to fulfill his covenant promises that he makes. And that's just such a comfort and such a encouraging, or God-glorifying lesson for us to take away from this text. But not only do we have that lesson or that big picture idea, but you have this lesson here for us on a practical level about Jehoshaphat and Jehoiada. You know, they took this young baby into their family and raised him for the next 6 years. He was like their own child. And really what you see them doing is being a biblical form of foster parents. And so the question I want to ask today, and you can leave comments here in the video as you have ideas, how do you think that their example illustrates what foster parenting is and what we can learn about foster parenting from their example? You know, I know several families who are foster parents, and I have several friends who were foster kids as growing up. And there's a great need for foster parenting in our day right now. And people that rise up to that challenge and do that are not necessarily because they just want to have kids to parent. They're also rising to meet the needs that are in their lives that God brings to them. Just like Jehoshabeth and Jehoiah didn't wake up one day and say, we should be foster parents. They saw that God had brought a situation to their attention and they responded in grace. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts? How does this relate to our contemporary need for foster care and foster parenting, and maybe your experiences on that subject, and so forth. Next time we meet, we're going to be considering how several people in Joash's life took a huge risk to bring about and fulfill God's covenant promise in their life. In other words, to put him on the throne. And we're going to see what that looks like for them and what it might look like for us. So until then, be safe and have a blessed week.